Win here. Welcome back. If you're working with ServiceNow and wondering who can see or edit what, then this video is exactly what you need. In today's video, we're breaking down access control rules or ACLs in ServiceNow. So let's start with the basics. An ACL or an access control rule determines who can access specific data in ServiceNow and what they can do with it. Think of ACLs as security guards at a door. They check who you are, what you're trying to access, and whether you're allowed in. So what exactly can ACLs control? They control access to tables, records, and fields, and you determine this when you essentially configure your ACLs. Now, there are out-of-the-box ACLs that ServiceNow provide, but if you do essentially want to modify them or create new ones depending on requirements, then essentially you can create this. And coming back to, do you want to provide the table access to the particular user or set of users, records, particular set of records, or fields, particular set of fields. And not just viewing, they also provide access for create, read, write, or delete, essentially your CRUD functions. So how do ACLs work? So essentially, before actually we go into how they work, let's talk about the types of ACLs. So we've talked about the tables, records, and fields, and let's just dive into that a little bit more. So table level ACLs, they apply to entire tables. So you can be able to control access, as we talked about, that create, read, update, or delete for an entire table, or a record, so apply to individual records, often used conditions or scripts to limit access. So when we talk about individual records, I think certain things you want to stray away from is providing, like, let's say for example we're looking to only allow certain incidents to be seen by certain users. Now, to put in the incident number is not a great solution. That's not something you should go for. However, what you should look at is, if we're looking to provide access to a certain set of incidents, what is a common defactor of that incident? So could it be something around CI? Could it be, if it's a priority one, only certain users could see it? So really what you're looking at is data points that define the buckets of data that you'd want people to see or not see, and then essentially be able to drive it in that way. So keep that in mind when we talk about record level ACLs. And then essentially field level ACLs. Now these are applied to specific fields within a record. So one example is, let's say you have an incident and you might have some release notes, but you also just want to show that to a particular set of users that might have the release role. So essentially it could be something along those lines, and it all kind of depends on the requirement. One example around field level ACLs, to just give another one, essentially if a user is a major incident manager or agent, then they essentially might see more fields on the particular incident table that a general agent wouldn't see. So that's just one example in terms of what you can do. Now, how do ACLs actually work? So here's how ACL evaluation works in simple terms. So user tries to access a resource. ServiceNow checks the matching ACL rules. Conditions and scripts are evaluated, and then the access is either granted or denied. So let's dive into that a little bit more with an example. So I'm going to go to an incident record. And actually, before I dive into this, there's a few things that you should be aware of, just to kind of show what I'm seeing. So first things first is, what you're going to want to do is, let's just open a new tab. So over here, first things first, I want to go and debug. Let's see if I can refresh this. Okay, spelling wrong, that's the issue. So essentially, when you go to debug, you will see a bunch of stuff there. So if I just go to debug. Now, if you enable all, this will essentially enable all the logs for the following, and you'll see what that looks like in a moment. So what I would say though is if you do enable all, it does become very slow. So just for this particular example, we're only going to look at debugging security. So essentially when you click this, what this will do is it will enable um, the debug to appear on the bottom of the form. So for example, if I'm looking at incident or any list view, if I scroll down to the bottom, I'm going to see the debug output. And essentially I could just filter on security rules, I can filter on particular applications. It just helps you to see, because there is a lot of data that will essentially show here. Now, essentially, I've tried to access this incident and essentially I can see this incident, but over here is where you can see the matching ACL rules. Now, there are a lot of us discussed, so essentially, let's just see if I can remove any of these. But really, I just want to focus on the global application. And then essentially here, these are all of the ACLs that kick off. So you can see here, this is an incident.star, which is essentially that global incident table. So all fields under incident, I can essentially write to them. And then there's this field rule, which is essentially an incident underscore state, which allows me to write, and that access has been allowed. So let's go into this rule. And one thing to mention, when you're actually looking to modify incidents, you do need a privileged access. So essentially, in order to be able to do that, you want to go to your profile, elevate role, and you'll see the security admin. And this grants modification access to ACLs, allowing users to modify the ACL controller. So if you do want to modify, you do need to enable this. And it just ensures that extra level of security, because modifying ACLs can actually be very impacting to the platform if you're not aware you're doing it, and it could cause issues. So you just want to be very conscious when you're essentially modifying or updating any ACLs. Okay, so we're in this record here. This is an ACL. So as you can see here, this determines the type. So if it's a record, as we discussed, if it's a table, or if it's a field, essentially then what the operation is. So we've got write, read, delete, and create, and we're just gonna essentially focus on these four, as this is just the basics of ACLs, and there are a few other things, and we can go over that into a separate video and just advanced operations. But essentially, let's focus on create, read, write, and delete. So really, I just want the operation to be right on this particular one, and then essentially decision type, allow if or deny unless. So that just says if I want to allow it, or if the condition is met, do I want to deny it. Okay, admin overrides, essentially what that means is if admin, this doesn't apply and I override it. So even if I don't have a specific role, I essentially could override it. So it really just depends how crucial the ACL and the requirement is. If it's very sensitive, you wouldn't even want admin to override it. And some examples could be around HR specific ACLs. Okay, as there is a separate HR admin role, so essentially you don't want admin to override it, but you might have the role below as HR admin, and we'll talk about the roles below in a moment. And then if you want to put any descriptions to provide that essential overview of what the ACL is, we've got the name and then essentially the field incident state here, which we're looking at now. If I essentially scroll down here, I can essentially apply it and add a condition. So at the moment I'm just leaving it blank, so this applies to basically any incidents. And then essentially the role. Now when we talk about role, this will only essentially trigger if the role has admin. So this ACL will allow or will run essentially if I have this role. If I don't, then essentially it will deny access, and that's essentially how that works. And then essentially it will allow me to write to essentially these records. Now, what if I go to advanced? This is where essentially you can add a script to essentially provide more details, but because this is very simple, I just want them to write If not, it's just very basic. And you can see here the debug output has also applied here. So once you turn this on, it will kind of happen or run for every kind of form and list view that you essentially kick off. So one thing I do want to point out, as I said, this is very performance impacting. It can be very slow, so you generally do not want to do this in production if you can help it. And you want to do most of your debugging on like a dev or test instance. And essentially once you've done that, you do want to go and disable. So essentially if I just go back to the form and I will essentially just debug all security, and I can click on stop debugging, and that should essentially leave that page. So now if I just go back to the instance and refresh this, I can see this is gone. So essentially now I don't have that debug output no more. So that's essentially ACLs. We talked about how they work. We talked about the ACL rules, the conditions and scripts are evaluated as we showcased that, and essentially once access is granted or denied. And if we just go back here, you can see the green checks is basically saying access is denied. And if we look at one of the red ones here, so essentially this particular rule has been essentially evaluated as false. So essentially whatever this rule is allowing me to do is not denied, it's not providing me access to do it. Great. So that's essentially it in a nutshell. Common mistakes to avoid. So not testing ACL with different user roles. So whenever you're building an ACL, you do need to ensure that you're testing with different personas. So whatever the rule is, if you're testing as an admin, you do want to test it with either the role specifically or also a user without the role as well. So you ensure that you have the access evaluated as true as well as the access evaluated false, just to ensure it's working correctly. The reason why I always say to do this and to test with as many roles as you think would be crucial to this particular to the particular ACL requirement is because you do have a lot of ACLs at one, and there could be masking involved. So though one ACL will probably deny access, there might be another rule that allows it, and essentially once one denies it, it should essentially stop. But you do want to check and test that and just make sure that the outcome is what you expect. Ignoring field level restrictions. So essentially if you're trying to do a table ACL and it's not working, you do need to deep dive into the other ACLs that might be actually providing a deny, because that essentially could be overriding your ACL from working. Overusing scripts. Now you can write scripts, but if you can, I think keeping it simple is the best kind of output for ACLs. Keep it simple so it's easier to debug going forward, and not reviewing multiple scripts, as you can have many ACLs run on a table. You want to keep it as simple as possible. And forgetting to use the ACL debug tool. So the ACLs are not working, do use the debug tool. I kind of showed how we can enable that, how you can look at the records and essentially just deep dive into it. Let's talk about some best practices now. Use roles whenever possible to simplify ACL management. So as we go back to our ACL, essentially if I just go to, let's also show this very quickly here. So if I type in access controls, this will take me to essentially all the ACLs, and essentially here, this is where I can kind of search for the ACL. Now what I want to do is essentially just search for anything that is related to incidents. So if I just do contains INC, I can see kind of the incidents here. So let's click on this one as an example. And this is essentially how you can check the all the ACLs. Essentially go to the application navigator, access controls, and then you can check the list of ACLs. There is another way to do it as well, actually. So if I go to incident this. So let's just go to the table view, and then if I go to configure and I go to security rules, then I can see all of the ACLs that apply to incident. So if I go back to incident, I just want to click on, let's just click on this one here. So let's open this record. Okay, and yeah, where possible, add roles essentially here. So this is one of the best ways to essentially add a role. If you want to, you could always add it to the script as well. And really, you want to use scripts as essentially some function that can't be added by roles, like an approver is a pretty good use case where you'd want to use an advanced condition and a script to essentially see if it's a user, if it's an approver of this item, then they should be able to read it as an example. And there's no essentially even if you provide a role, you just want to make it specific that it's particular approver for this role, just not the approver role as an example. Great. Avoid overly complex scripts, so try not to write too much, as in it just becomes unmanageable at one point. Always test using impersonation, so if you're not sure what that is, essentially you can go to your profile, impersonate a user, and essentially search for a particular user with the roles that you require it to be. So you essentially create a test user, provide the right roles, and then essentially impersonate and test it as that user. Use a security debug mode to trace access issues, so we've gone over that video, and essentially document ACLs clearly for maintainability. Using that description to explain what the ACL is doing is very, very important. And that's ACLs in ServiceNow. Simple, right? If this helped, hit the like button, subscribe for more ServiceNow tutorials. If you've got any questions about ACL, please do drop them in the comments and I'll help you out. Thank you all. Hope you have a great day. Bye.